until 1985.
It was then, during a solo dive, that Henri Cosquet from Marseille
Slithered up a narrow 150-meter-long passageway and discovered an immense cavern.
What if a cave sealed for 30,000 years was hiding something humans were never supposed to see? Off the French coast, 37 meters underwater, a mysterious cave had remained sealed since the end of the Ice Age. No archaeologist had entered it. In 1985, recreational diver Henri Cosquer discovered the entrance while exploring near Cap Morgiou in the Calanques outside Marseille. He wasn't searching for history. He was simply curious. Before we reveal what Cosquer found inside that ancient underwater cave, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next is something you won't want to miss. At about 121 feet below the surface, Cosquer followed the opening into a narrow flooded passage stretching roughly 175 meters or 574 feet, gradually rising through complete darkness. He returned alone again and again, pushing deeper each time. During one dive, his lamp failed deep inside. Trapped in pitch-black water, he had to find his way back without knowing how far remained. By 1990, Cosquer realized the passage was too dangerous and too long to explore alone. And that's when outside help finally arrived, bringing in help for the final stretch. In 1990, Cosquer enlisted two Belgian cave divers, brothers Bernard and Mark van Espen, to help extend the guideline further into the passage. Following Cosquer's directions, they swam carefully to avoid disturbing the fine silt covering the tunnel floor, since stirring up that sediment could turn the already dark water completely opaque and strand a diver with zero visibility. They eventually reached an underground lake with a pocket of trapped air sitting just above the water's surface, a strong sign that dry, unflooded space existed somewhere beyond it. Their guideline ran out before they could go any further, so they had to turn back without confirming what sat past that lake. The mystery of the cave's dry sections stayed unsolved for almost another year. In June 1991, Mark van Espen returned to finish the job, laying the final stretch of guideline needed to safely reach whatever lay beyond the flooded tunnel. That dive was short and only explored the first chamber, but it proved the dry space was really there and could finally be reached safely. A few weeks later, Cosquer went back one more time, and this trip is the one that actually brought the cave's secret into the light. The final push to the dry chamber. On July 9, 1991, Cosquer returned with his niece, Sandrine Cosquer, along with friends Jan Goguen and Pascal Auriol. This time, the group pushed further into the dry chambers than anyone had gone before, finally getting a real look at the space that had been sitting sealed off from the outside world since the end of the last Ice Age. Cosquer's own first reaction when he saw markings on the walls was not excitement. He later said his immediate thought was that someone had come down and spray-painted graffiti on the rock, since the idea of genuine prehistoric art sitting inside a cave nobody could reach without scuba equipment seemed almost too strange to consider. It only slowly dawned on him and the others that what they were looking at was not modern vandalism at all, but something that had been sitting untouched in that chamber for tens of thousands of years. That moment of recognition should have been the highlight of the whole story. Instead, tragedy struck within weeks, and it was that tragedy, not the discovery itself, that finally forced the cave into public view. The tragedy that made it public. In September 1991, disaster struck. 3 divers from Grenoble, exploring the same underwater passage on their own, after word of the discovery had started to spread informally among the local diving community, got lost in the tunnel and died before they could find their way back out. Kosker and Jan Gogen took part in recovering their bodies from the passage, a grim task that made continuing to keep the discovery private no longer an option. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1991, Kosker formally reported the cave to France's Maritime Affairs Department in Marseille. That report set off a formal chain of authority, with the discovery quickly referred to the Regional Archaeological Service under the Ministry of Culture. What had spent 6 years as one diver's private curiosity was now, almost overnight, a matter for the French state to investigate and verify. A discovery buried behind a tragedy like that needed serious, careful verification before anyone could trust what was actually being described, and finding someone qualified to do that verification turned out to be its own strange problem. The archaeologist who had to learn to cave dive. Confirming that the paintings were genuine required an expert who could personally examine them, but almost no archaeologist specializing in the Paleolithic period had the diving skill needed to reach a chamber 37 meters underwater through a narrow tunnel. Authorities eventually turned to Jean Courtin, an archaeologist with expertise closer to the Neolithic period, because he was one of the only qualified researchers physically capable of making that dive. From September 18th to 20th, 1991, an expedition led by Courtin, joined by cave art specialist Jean Klotz, traveled out aboard a research vessel called the Archaeonaut to examine the site directly. Klotz himself was not yet a diver at that point. He had first heard about the cave through Kosker's photographs while working at the Ministry of Culture, and found them intriguing enough that he eventually learned to scuba dive at age 69, specifically so he could study the cave in person, going on to make dozens of visits over the following years despite rough seas and difficult weather regularly cancelling planned trips. Courtin authenticated the site in 1991, confirming that the paintings and engravings were genuinely ancient, rather than a modern fake staged inside a hard-to-reach cave. That confirmation raised an obvious question almost immediately. If this cave held real Ice Age paintings, how did an ancient art gallery end up sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea in the first place? It also did not put every doubt to rest right away. For a while, some very public skepticism threatened to overshadow the discovery entirely. The doubters who almost buried the discovery. France has more decorated Ice Age caves than any other country on Earth, but every single one of them, before Kosker, had been found west of the Rhône River. Nobody had ever discovered anything like this east of the Rhône in the Provence region, and that geographic surprise alone was enough to make several prehistorians publicly question whether the paintings were real. The skepticism grew louder once specific details of the artwork reached the press. Critics pointed to the presence of what looked like a penguin, an animal nobody expected to see in French Ice Age art, along with hands that appeared to have fingers deliberately cut off, and the odd coincidence that the lower edge of several painted horses lined up neatly with the cave's current waterline. Some of this criticism played out publicly in the Spanish newspaper El País, where questions were raised about whether the whole site might be an elaborate forgery. Spanish prehistorian Antonio Beltran pushed back directly in response, pointing out that while he had not personally been aware of penguin-like images in cave art before, other genuinely rare animals, such as snow hares, had turned up in verified prehistoric paintings elsewhere. So, an unusual species alone was not solid grounds for dismissing the entire site. These doubts did not last. Once excavation and conservation campaigns got fully underway in 1992 and 1994, involving Jean Klotz alongside a growing circle of other specialists, the accumulating physical evidence steadily closed off the forgery theory for good. That evidence also finally answered the much bigger question hanging over the whole discovery. How did a cave now sitting deep underwater ever hold open-air paintings in the first place? How a cave 6 kilometers from the coast ended up underwater. During the last glacial period, the world looked completely different along this stretch of coastline. Sea levels sat as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than they do today, since huge volumes of the planet's water were locked up in glaciers and ice sheets at that time. The cave sat roughly 6 kilometers inland, overlooking an open, steppe-like landscape rather than any ocean. Around 10,000 years ago, during the warming period known as the Holocene, glaciers began melting rapidly and sea levels rose across the globe. The Mediterranean coastline crept steadily inland over thousands of years, until it swallowed the valley in front of the cave entirely, then kept rising until it submerged the entrance itself, cutting off any dry access to the cave by roughly 9,000 years ago. The cave was never deliberately hidden by anyone. It was slowly drowned by a changing planet, sealed behind a barrier of seawater instead of collapsed stone. If you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. That kind of watery seal is nearly impossible to fake, but proving the actual age of the paintings inside still needed hard, verifiable science, and that process did not go smoothly at first. Proving it was not a hoax. When early estimates for the cave's age were first announced, some researchers pushed back, since the numbers being proposed sounded too old to trust without direct confirmation. Radiocarbon dating on samples. This ancient is technically difficult, but not impossible, and researchers eventually built a strong enough case using multiple independent lines of evidence. The clearest physical proof came from thin layers of calcite, a mineral that slowly forms over the rock surface, which had grown directly on top of several paintings. That kind of mineral coating simply cannot form in a few decades, so any painting sitting beneath a calcite layer had to be genuinely ancient. In 1998, researchers strengthened the case further with fragments of wood and pollen recovered from the site, giving them organic material that lined up with the same time period. Eventually, researchers Jean Klotz and Jean Courtin collected 27 separate radiocarbon dates from the cave, and the results clustered into two distinct groups, one centered around 27,000 years ago and another around 19,000 years ago. That two-phase result meant this cave was not decorated in one visit by one group of people. Later research expanded on this picture significantly. Between 1992 and 2012, researchers ran around 60 separate radiocarbon tests on 41 different samples, confirming a long span of visits stretching from roughly 33,000 down to 19,000 years ago in two major, almost continuous phases. That timeline places the cave's earliest visitors at roughly the same period as the last people to use the famous Chauvet Cave further north, while its final visitors overlapped with the era of the artists working at Lascaux. The two phases also line up with two distinct prehistoric cultures. The earlier visits, including most of the cave's hand stencils, belong to the Gravettian culture, and the later visits belong to the Solutrean culture, known elsewhere in Europe for a real leap forward in tool-making, including fitting stone blades onto wooden handles carved from pine and birch. That same Solutrean period across Europe is also when the famous carved Venus figurines start appearing at other sites, meaning the artists who returned to paint over Cosquer's older Gravettian handprints were working with noticeably more advanced tools and techniques than the people who had visited the same walls 8,000 years earlier. This raised a much bigger question about who these visitors actually were and why so much of what they painted did not match anything else found in French cave art. Animals that should not be in a French cave. Most famous Ice Age caves in France, including Lascaux and Chauvet, are covered in horses, bison, mammoths, and other land animals that lived across the open plains and forests of Ice Age Europe. Cosquer's walls tell a different story. Alongside horses, ibex, chamois, and an extinct giant deer called the megaloceros, the cave contains dozens of images of seals, along with birds that most visitors describe as penguins. The full count of imagery inside the cave now stands at roughly 500 individual paintings and engravings, representing 11 different species, including a cave lion and a saiga antelope, both animals that have since vanished entirely from the Mediterranean region, alongside around 200 separate geometric signs scattered across the walls. Those birds were almost certainly not true penguins, since penguins have never existed anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Researchers studying the images believe the artists were painting the great auk, a large flightless seabird that once thrived across the North Atlantic and looked remarkably similar to a small penguin, complete with a black and white body built for swimming rather than flying. The great auk eventually went extinct in the 1800s, hunted out of existence long after these paintings were made, which makes Cosquer one of the only places on Earth where you can see one memorialized in ochre and charcoal. The cave also includes markings some researchers believe represent jellyfish or octopi, adding even more marine life to a gallery that should, by every other example from this era, have stayed firmly on dry land. That marine subject matter makes sense once you remember the cave's original setting near the Ice Age coastline. But the strangest and most debated images inside Cosquer are not animals at all. What the cave floor, preserved beyond the painted and engraved walls, the floor of Cosquer's dry chambers still holds physical traces left behind by the people who visited, untouched by scavengers or later human activity. Thanks to the cave's near-total isolation, archaeologists have recovered charcoal remains from old fires and torches, along with a small number of flint tools left scattered across the ground. One particularly striking find is a calcite plaque measuring about 21.7 centimeters long that researchers believe was used as a lamp, likely holding burning fat or oil to light the way through chambers that would otherwise have sat in complete darkness. These floor deposits matter just as much as the wall art itself, since burned material like torch charcoal can be radiocarbon dated directly, giving researchers an independent way to confirm the timeline drawn from the paintings above. A lamp, a scattering of tools, and the remains of old fires paint a quiet picture of real people moving carefully through unfamiliar, dark passageways, doing exactly what any person exploring a cave without electric light would need to do to see where they were going. That same combination of careful, repeated visits is exactly what makes the cave's most debated feature, its many handprints so difficult to fully explain. The hands with missing fingers. Among the earliest artwork inside the cave sit dozens of hand stencils, made by pressing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it to leave a ghostly outline behind. Estimates of the total number vary slightly, depending on the source, with official French heritage records citing 55 negative hand stencils alongside extensive finger fluting, while other researchers have counted closer to 65 individual stencils across the cave, made in both red and black pigment. A striking number of them appear to be missing one or more fingers. Thumbs are almost always shown fully intact, while the other fingers are the ones that disappear. This same strange pattern shows up at other caves too, and researchers now recognize it as a recurring feature specifically tied to the Gravettian culture that produced art across large parts of Europe during this period. At Gargas in the French Pyrenees, over 100 of more than 200 recorded hand stencils are missing digits. At Maltravieso in Spain, the majority of hand images show the same pattern. Researchers have proposed several competing explanations. Some argue the fingers were simply bent down out of view rather than physically missing, similar to how you might fold fingers down to make a shadow puppet. Others point to frostbite, since the specific pattern of missing fingers, sparing the thumb while shortening the others, closely matches how frostbite actually damages human hands in extreme cold. A related theory suggests the missing fingers formed a deliberate signaling system, a kind of early sign alphabet, where different finger combinations carried specific meanings understood within the community, though this remains speculative. A smaller number of researchers argue for deliberate ritual mutilation, though other specialists consider that theory unlikely since losing multiple fingers on purpose would have been a serious survival risk for people who depended on their hands for hunting and tool-making. Nobody has settled which explanation is correct, and that uncertainty makes these hands one of the most argued-over details in all of Paleolithic art. They are also not the only unusual human trace left behind on these walls. The rarest image in Ice Age art, cave art from this period, almost never shows recognizable human figures. Painters from this era overwhelmingly chose animals, geometric signs, and hand stencils, leaving full human bodies almost entirely out of the picture across nearly every major site in Europe. Koska breaks that pattern with two unusual engravings. One shows a figure that combines the lower body of a seal with the upper body of a man. The other, even more startling, shows a human figure that appears to have been struck by a spear or similar weapon, described by researchers who studied it as an image resembling a killed or wounded man. Nobody knows what story either image was meant to tell. It could represent a hunting accident, a symbolic warning, a ritual scene, or something from a belief system that left no written or spoken record behind for anyone to recover. What is certain is that both images are exceptionally rare subjects for this entire era of art, and their presence inside Kosker adds yet another layer to a cave that keeps breaking the standard pattern of what Ice Age painters usually chose to create. As remarkable as the surviving artwork is, a huge portion of what once decorated this cave is already gone for good, and the reason ties directly back to the same rising sea that hid the entrance in the first place. What the rising sea already destroyed. Because sea levels rose gradually rather than all at once, the lowest sections of the cave were the first to disappear underwater, and a significant share of whatever artwork once covered those lower walls has been lost completely, dissolved or worn away by seawater, long before Henri Kosker ever arrived. What survives today sits mostly in the upper chambers, the sections that stayed above the rising waterline long enough to remain partially preserved, even as the entrance itself sank below the surface. Research attention on the cave actually slowed down for several years after 1994, once the far more accessible Chauvet Cave was discovered in the Ardèche region and pulled funding and scientific interest away from the difficult, expensive logistics of underwater fieldwork. It took until 2011 for the alarm to be raised again, in earnest, when researchers Michel Olive and Luc Vanrel documented rapidly worsening damage to several images caused by accelerating sea level rise. A warning that pushed the cave's preservation back to the top of the research priority list. Continued erosion, shifting currents, and rising modern sea levels all put additional pressure on what remains, meaning the surviving artwork exists on borrowed time in a way that dry inland caves like Lascaux and Chauvet simply do not have to worry about. Given how fragile the surviving art actually is, protecting it from further damage, including damage caused by careless visitors, became just as urgent as studying it in the first place. Part of that protection effort involved keeping certain details about the cave's structure completely out of public view for decades. A second entrance kept secret. In March 1992, researchers discovered a second entrance into the cave system, separate from the original underwater passage Koska had followed years earlier. Rather than announcing this discovery publicly, authorities chose to keep its location secret, a decision that held for more than 30 years, driven by concerns about unauthorized access and the risk that publicizing a second way in could make the fragile site far harder to secure and protect. That kind of long-term secrecy reflects just how seriously French authorities have treated the site's vulnerability, especially given how easily uncontrolled visits could damage artwork that had already survived tens of thousands of years underwater. It also fits into a broader, sometimes complicated relationship between Koska, the original discoverer, and the government agencies now responsible for the cave's future. Protecting what is left diving into the real Koska cave today is not allowed for the public, and access is restricted to a small number of qualified researchers working under tight scientific supervision. French authorities and researchers, led by figures such as scientific director Cyril Montoya, continue running structured research campaigns to study the cave without accelerating its decay. Henri Cosquer himself later pursued a legal dispute with the Ministry of Culture, seeking compensation and a share of profits connected to the site under a French law passed in 2001 that entitles the original discoverers of archaeological sites to a financial reward tied to the site's historical value. To let the public experience the site without risking the original artwork, a detailed full-scale replica called Cosquer Méditerranée opened in Marseille on June 4, 2022, built by the company Kleber Rossillon, the same firm responsible for managing the well-known Chauvet Cave replica further north. Visitors enter through simulated exploration pods designed to recreate the sensation of surfacing from underwater into the cave's dry chambers, before walking through a meticulously recreated version of the paintings and engravings, including a full reconstruction of the panel of horses. Researchers also built a full digital scan of the cave's surviving upper sections, which geologist Jacques Collina-Girard has described as a kind of preserved memory of a place the sea will eventually reclaim entirely, giving both the public and future scientists a way to study the site long after the real cave finally disappears beneath the water for good. The genuine cave stays sealed behind seawater and strict access limits, exactly as it has remained for decades. Even with all of that careful research completed so far, a long list of basic questions about this cave remains stubbornly unanswered. What scientists still do not know, nobody can say for certain why marine animals appear so prominently on these walls when almost no other Ice Age cave art anywhere in Europe focuses on sea creatures this heavily. Nobody knows why some visitors chose to leave hand stencils with fingers folded or missing, or what meaning that gesture actually carried for the people who made it. Nobody has explained why two separate groups of people, separated by roughly 8,000 years and working with noticeably different toolkits, both chose this same hard-to-reach cave to create their art, or whether the second group knew anything at all about the images the first group had left behind in the dark. What it all adds up to, every detail in this story comes from verified radiocarbon dating, calcite layer analysis, and decades of incredibly difficult underwater fieldwork by trained divers and archaeologists working together in dangerous conditions. What began with one diver following a strange opening in an underwater rock wall eventually became one of the world's rare Ice Age art sites. Instead of the familiar horses and mammoths found elsewhere, this cave contains images of seals, extinct seabirds, and even a wounded man. And perhaps the strangest part is that rising sea levels, which could have destroyed the cave completely, actually sealed parts of it away for thousands of years, preserving an unexpected glimpse of Ice Age life before Henry Cosquer ever switched on his light. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.